For many centuries, London was a dangerous place. It was a magnet for the very worst kind of people. Jack the Ripper dominated the headlines, but he wasn't the only killer around. Murder was afoot. The fear of death was everywhere. But police had their work cut out to track the culprits down. In this series, we'll be investigating some of the city's most notorious and intriguing crimes.
The female defendant.
Sexual intrigue, vicious murder, as well as the latest technology, fed the nation's insatiable desire for gruesome stories of London's dark side. Edwardian London saw great changes in the city. The capital was the financial center of the world, and a whole new era was being ushered in. But at the same time, some rather unsavory characters were making their way here. Fortunately, the Metropolitan Police was changing dramatically and had a whole new set of methods to track them down and, just as vitally, to convict them in court.
You had a system called Bertillonage, after Alphonse Bertillon. How this worked was that cards were made out and a criminal was measured. Length of his fingers, size of his head, size of his ears, size of his body. Well, you can imagine putting all these down on cards and then trying to get some form of identification when you've got thousands of cards to compare was almost impossible. So fingerprints are going to change all that in 1905.
The first murder solved in Britain by fingerprints. Murder in Deptford High Street. There was a thumbprint on the cash box, and that led to the conviction of the Stratton brothers. And this led to an almost sort of scientific approach, which started to build Scotland Yard's international reputation.
The new police force and the realm of forensic science would be tested on terrible crimes that were to take place in London. Two of the most notorious were in Camden town.
Camden at this time is described as being very noisy and dirty. Lots of lorries, horse-drawn vehicles, pubs, and the common people who go to them.
Camden has always been a place that attracted a wide variety of characters. Everyone from the bare-knuckle fighter Tom Sayer to the great novelist Charles Dickens moved to this part of North London. In the early 20th century, though, the local community in Camden would be shocked to the core by two brutal killings. The first, in 1907, became known as the Camden Town Murder. It was a crime that harked back to the time of Jack the Ripper 20 years earlier, because it involved the murder of a prostitute named Emily Dimmock, who had her throat slashed in her home by a client. Her body was discovered the next day by her partner, and the story grabbed the public's attention. The case aroused the interest of the artist Walter Sickert. He painted a series of works on the Camden Town murder. A man named Robert Wood was apprehended and charged with the crime, based on some writing on a postcard found in the victim's room. But a brilliant defense by the famous barrister Edward Marshall Hall would see him found innocent in court. The case remains unsolved. Just a couple of years later, though, Edward Marshall Hall would again be called to the defense, this time in the case of Dr. Crippen.
Crippin was an American, trained to be a doctor. He came to England, but his medical qualifications weren't recognised. And so he went to work for a patent company dealing with various medicines.
The dividing line between patent medicines and being a quack doctor is a bit blurred. But nevertheless, I'm sure there'd be many people who took what Dr. Crippen gave them and were very grateful. He became friendly with Kora Crippin. She wanted to be a singer. She used to perform on the music hall stage, which was very popular in those days, and she went by the name of Belle Elmore.
She wanted to sing grand opera, but she didn't have the voice or the talent.
The story of Harvey Hawley Crippen remains one of the most enduring crimes of the 20th century. Some key mysteries surround the case, which have puzzled amateur sleuths for years. This is a sordid and absorbing tale of love lives gone horribly wrong. It all begins when Dr. Crippen and his wife Kora move into number 39 Hilldrop Crescent in Camden.
Bright and stylish girl you see, belle of good society, not too strict but rather free, yet as right can be, never forward, never bold, not too shy and not too cold, but the very thing I'm told that in your arms you'd like to fold. What do you think, darling?
It's nice.
Oh, you know I hate that word.
So, I had a meeting with Mrs. Curnow today. I decided. Mrs. Curnow was real sorry. I've decided I'm leaving Munions. Would you mind? Munions just isn't right for me anymore. It's time I focused my energies where it matters, on my other ventures, like we talked about.
The Harvard tooth pullers?
Yale. It's Yale. And you know what? The dentistry is going from strength to strength. In fact, with a little capital investment, a couple of £100. Kora.
Belle, darling.
It's my money too.
Ta-ra-ra bum dee ta-ra-ra bum dee
Kora.
Ta-ra-ra bum dee
You're my wife.
Ta-ra-ra bum dee ta-ra-ra bum dee ta-ra-ra.
Crippen, besides working for a patent medicine company, also worked for a deaf centre. And it's there he met a young typist called Ethel Leneve. The two of them began an affair.
Crippen had been promising her one day it would be better than this. All of a sudden in February, according to her landlady, she cheered up.
Good morning, Dr. Crippen.
I want you to move in with me.
What about your wife? He used to buy me dinner after work. I think at first he was just avoiding going home. He used to say he and Kora, his wife, had drifted apart in sympathy. Then our sneaking off became rather a pleasant routine.
Dr. Crippen was keeping up his routine well. He and his wife Kora entertained their theatrical friends, among whom were the Martinettis, at their home in Hilldrop Crescent.
Mr. Martinetti was a sort of an ageing music hall artist, and Mrs. Martinetti was on a sort of a ladies' club for music hall artists.
Hello. Come in.
Oh, I do so long for spring. smells divine in here. Where's Belle?
Let me take your coat.
Oh, don't mind him.
Excuse me. Well, at least if I collapse, I'll know there's a doctor in the house.
Of course I'm married, and we all have our little dramas from time to time. But I thought they got on well.
I'm looking into the wings. I can't even see Lily now.
No.
She's run off.
It's your worst nightmare as a performer.
Just before her entrance, I could not believe it.
Oh, no one in the audience even noticed.
Yes, I'm quite sure you were wonderful.
Oh, thank you, darling.
Isn't he a dear?
So, who's for a game of whist?
Oh, certainly, yes.
We stayed in it until around 1:30. But Paul was still under the weather, and darling Belle suggested that we stay the night. That was so like her. But I insisted on getting him home. I didn't want to bother her. I just wish we'd stayed. But I suppose he would have found his cue another night.
Crippen made sure he put on this show of love and affection when the Martinetti couple came over to 39 Hilldrop Crescent for dinner. But it was all a mask. The events that would unfold would see one of the most notorious killers of the 20th century flee across the Atlantic to Canada. With him would be his mistress, Ethel Leneve, who had disguised herself as a boy. The desperate duo would be pursued by one of Scotland Yard's finest, who was determined to bring them in. Camden, January the 31st, 1910. In a townhouse at 39 Hilldrop Crescent, Dr. Crippen and his wife were joined by the Martinettis for dinner, followed by an enjoyable game of whist. The Martinettis had been musical performers, just like Belle Elmore, and they left at around 1:30 a.m. And the story of Dr. Crippen began.
You've been so sweet.
Nobody knows for sure what happened that night. The supposition is Dr. Crippen murdered Kora Crippin by giving her something to drink.
There are two theories. A shot was heard, and he may have shot her. But in the body was found traces of hyoscine.
Hyoscine was used to calm mental patients in very small amounts. Dr. Crippen had ordered a substantial amount of hyoscine from the local chemist.
The truth is, we simply don't know what happened next. A large dose of hyoscine can have varied effects, especially when mixed with alcohol. Belle likely became frantic, delirious even. Some neighbors reported hearing gunshots and screams coming from the direction of Crippin's house that night, so maybe Crippen panicked and shot her. Those reports were unconfirmed, however, so it's possible that she simply fell unconscious, slipped into a coma, and died. What is certain is that Belle was never seen again after that night. The next morning, Crippen went to work as usual, and when he returned home, the rest of his plan was put into action.
To the Committee of the Music Hall Ladies Guild. Dear friends, Forgive me a hasty letter and any inconvenience I may cause you. But I have just had the bad news of the illness of a near relative. And at only a few hours' notice, I am obliged to go to America. Yours faithfully, Belle Elmore.
Dr. Crippen put it out that Kora had been called back to America. Ethel moved in to Dr. Crippin's house.
And soon Ethel and Abe is seen wearing Mrs. Crippin's furs, she's wearing Mrs. Crippin's jewellery.
Krippen may have thought that all his problems had vanished in an instant. But thankfully, Belle was better liked by her friends than by her husband. Despite Crippen's hopes, Belle's friends had not forgotten her.
It just isn't like Belle. I mean, not even a note.
You're right. The thing is, she's been unwell. Yeah, I just heard from my people this morning. Her lungs, so you see...
Oh, the poor thing. And for a singer too, how terrible.
I don't know that it's as bad as all that. She said it wasn't.
So, you have heard from her?
What?
Belle told you that.
Yeah, but... Well, she's up in the mountains. Out in California, the wild's up there, so, you know...
Well, you send her our best wishes. She'll be back in fine voice soon, I'm certain. Our Belle's a fighter.
Oh yeah, she sure is.
All of a sudden, Dr. Crippen decided that the story he had concocted of his wife's urgent trip to Los Angeles was no longer sufficient on its own. He told her friends that she'd been taken seriously ill herself and was not expected to survive. Then he sent a telegram to Mrs. Martinetti to inform her of Kora's death and cremation. Suspicions were beginning to grow amongst Belle's friends. One friend who noticed her disappearance was the famous strongwoman Kate Williams, who went by the stage name Vulcana. Not somebody you'd want to be on the wrong side of.
Her act in the music hall was as a strong woman lifting great weights of barbells and that sort of thing. Vulcana came back from America. They had looked to try and catch up with what had happened to Kora and so on, but had drawn a complete blank. So they discussed it amongst their friends and then went to Scotland Yard to express their doubts.
The London community with which Dr. Crippen and his wife had become friendly had been rocked to the very core just over a decade earlier. The well-known actor, William Terrace, was stabbed outside the Adelphi Theatre. His killer was another actor, Richard Archer Prince, who had been his friend. Prince was declared insane and sent to Broadmoor Asylum. His sentence angered the theatrical community. Sir Henry Irving went so far as to say, "Terrace was an actor, so his murderer will not be executed." The William Terrace murder, though, had been a relatively straightforward affair for the London police. The Crippen mystery would be far more challenging. But fortunately, a man called Walter Dew was on the case. He was no stranger to shocking murder, having been one of the team that tried to capture Jack the Ripper 20 years earlier.
Dew was only a young policeman at the time of the Jack the Ripper murders. He joined 1882, about 6 years before the murders. And he said that it talked about the tension in the area, and you'd only got to say Jack the Ripper, and you could get an explosive incident. And when some lunatic runs down the street shouting, "I am Jack the Ripper, I am Jack the Ripper," immediately a lynch mob is formed. Dew and other policemen grab hold of this lunatic, have barricade themselves in a house, waiting for reinforcements, while outside a lynch mob is howling to get hold of this person and string them up on the nearest lamppost.
In the case of Dr. Crippen, Walter Dew's first move was to head over to Hilltop Crescent to get some answers to Kora's disappearance.
He's at work?
And you are his...
Housekeeper. If you come back later, he'll be here. You talk to him then. You should come back.
We would very much like to speak with him now, Miss Leneve.
He's at work? I could telephone.
Where is it your employer works?
The police would have their work cut out to bring him to justice. The case would be a sensation for press and public. Crippen had dispatched his wife, set up an elaborate story to promote his innocence, and moved his mistress, Ethel Leneve, into the marital home. But Inspector Dew had grown very suspicious. He made Ethel take him to see Dr. Crippen before she had a chance to telephone ahead and warn of the inspector's impending arrival. This time, though, he was to get his man. Dr. Crippen had murdered his wife, Kora, and moved his mistress, Ethel, into their house at 39 Hilltop Crescent, Camden. He had concocted an elaborate story, which began to slowly unravel once Inspector Dew started digging.
And she died in Los Angeles, is that correct?
Must be 3 months back now. Gosh, yeah, March 23rd.
And you're certain of that, Dr. Crippen?
I think I would remember a thing like that, don't you?
It's just the authorities there have no record of your wife's death.
Well, that is strange. I can't... Gosh, I suppose I had better tell the truth. My wife, my wife isn't dead. She left me. I feel a real fool, let me tell you. You think advertising in the States might help? You know, a reward for information, that sort of thing?
It might.
I'm just keen to help, you know, however I can, officer.
Inspector. You don't jump to the conclusion murder has been committed merely because a wife has disappeared and her husband has told lies about it. But he had lied.
Crippen was clearly spooked and decided that the best course of action would be to leave the country with Ethel immediately.
Certain people with no knowledge of police procedure and even less of the law blamed me for letting Crippen go. I ought to have arrested him, they said. But there had been no shred of evidence against him. It's futile to talk of arresting a man until you know there has been a crime.
Walter Dew made further inquiries over the weekend and called again at Hilltop Crescent on the Monday morning to find both Crippen and Ethel Leneve were no longer there.
The neighbours haven't seen them, sir, but we spoke to one of his colleagues. He says the doctor was at his office Saturday morning, Crippen gave him £2, told him to go and buy a boy's suit, tie and braces, a brown bowler hat, and size 5 boots.
What size shoe do you suppose Miss Leneve takes? I want descriptions of both of them circulated to all ports, domestic and foreign.
Yes, sir.
My quarry had gone, and the manner of his going pointed to guilt. Here was the real clue. His decision was a sudden one. Of that I felt convinced. He was scared.
As instructions were sent out to track down Dr. Crippen and his mistress Ethel Leneve, who had both suddenly disappeared, Inspector Walter Dew made further searches at the Crippen household. The first searches of the house showed no sign of Kora, and no evidence of a struggle or any kind of disturbance. The police were persistent, certain that Crippen wouldn't have fled so quickly for no reason. Eventually their persistence paid off. The police made a grim discovery in the cellar. Human remains covered in quicklime. The bones, head, limbs, and sex organs had been cut away.
The skull, arms, various bones are missing, and there's just this mangled pieces of flesh.
They called in the expert pathologists from Imperial College. They made tests on the flesh and found that it contained traces of hyoscine.
Large amounts of hyoscine were extracted. Its identity was confirmed by being tested on a cat. Apparently, a cat's eyes dilate in the presence of hyoscine. Belle Elmore could be identified only by a small piece of flesh from her abdomen. It bore a scar, consistent with an ovurectomy that she had undergone.
The pathologist was a young man called Bernard Spilsbury. He contradicted the other specialists who had been called in, and he'd found this scar tissue. The significance is that Mrs. Martinetti had seen a scar on Kora Crippin's abdomen. Apparently she'd had an operation. This becomes very relevant to the case.
Some of the parts of the flesh were wrapped up in what turned out to be, was identified as Crippin's pyjamas. And it then turned into a murder hunt.
A warrant was put out for Dr. Crippen and Ethel Leneve. False sightings were reported all over the country, but nobody knew for sure where they were.
This case caused enormous interest in the newspapers. It was an American doctor having an affair with his typist. It involved the music hall and a singer. So there was this great publicity, and lots of people came up with various leads on where Dr. Crippen might have gone to, including places on the continent.
The most promising lead came from a quite unexpected source. A ship on the Atlantic, the SS Montrose, that was headed to Canada. Its captain, Henry Kendall, had only 20 passengers traveling in second class on his ship, and he had become extremely suspicious of 2 of them.
It wasn't a very good way for them to have been anonymous.
They're using aliases. Ethel Lene had a haircut she disguised as Crippin's son.
The boat was equipped with the new Marconi wireless telegraph. So Kendall actually used this telegram to relay his suspicions to Scotland Yard.
Henry Kendall, captain of the SS Montrose, sent the following message to his head office in Liverpool. Montrose, 130 miles west of Lizard. Have strong suspicion that Crippen, London cellar murderer, and accomplice are amongst saloon passengers. Moustache shaved off, growing beard, accomplice dressed as a boy, voice, manner, and build, undoubtedly a girl. Kendall. Walter Dew had a tough decision to make. Whether to trust these unconfirmed reports by telegraph from a ship in the middle of the Atlantic. He decided he had to act and boarded another ship, the much faster Laurentic, that was due to arrive in Canada before the Montrose.
What made it a sensational case was that Dew used the wireless telegraph to send reports back to England. These were going in the newspapers, and Crippen, of course, with Ethel and Nave, were completely unaware of this going on, so the press were having a wonderful time with all this information.
Dew's ship raced across the Atlantic, landing in Canada 2 days before the Montrose was due to arrive. The murder of Kora Crippin and the flight of her husband were now a worldwide sensation. The press on both sides of the Atlantic were desperate for any detail about the case. Murder, adultery, theatre, technology. It was the perfect story. A large crowd gathered in Quebec to greet the arriving SS Montrose. Dew put on the uniform of a pilot officer and was rowed out to the ship accompanied by 2 officers of the Quebec City Police. Forewarned of his arrival, the ship's captain greeted him on the bridge and accompanied him to a private cabin. There, Dew waited until the Canadian policeman could bring him the man suspected of being the missing murderer. Dew could only wait.
Walter Dew, dressed up as a ship's captain, boarded the Montrose, spoke to the captain, and of course there wasn't really any doubt that it was Crippen and Ethel. They were then returned on the Laurentic's sister ship, the Magentic, back to Liverpool. Ethel and Neve was really pleased to be able to get out of boys' clothes, and she said Walter Dew was very kind because he allowed her to send out for some proper woman's clothes, and at Walter Dew's suggestion she got this hat with a veil so that her face would be protected from the press cameras.
On their return to London, Dr. Crippen and Ethel Lenive would face the full force of British justice. They would also find a public thirsting for every detail of this sensational murder, and a song written in their dubious honour. Dr. Crippen killed Belle Elmore, ran away with Miss Lenive, right across the ocean blue, followed by Inspector Dew. Ships ahoy, naughty boy! Dr. Crippen and Ethel Lenive were now back in London. They had attempted to flee to Canada on the ship SS Montrose, with Ethel assuming, rather oddly, the identity of a young boy. They had almost got away with it, but were thwarted by Inspector Walter Dew, who was awaiting their arrival in Canada with handcuffs at the ready in order to bring them back to London. Crippen was put on trial for the murder of his wife at the Old Bailey on October the 18th, 1910.
Hawley, Crippen, you are indicted and also charged on the coroner's inquisition with the willful murder of Kora Crippin on the 1st of February last. Are you guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty, my lord.
Dr. Crippen was, in many ways, a modest man. In others, he was egotistical. I shall always believe he was vain enough to think he had committed the perfect crime.
Expert opinion was provided by both the defense and the prosecution, and it often conflicted. One side would say that the carving up of the body found under the cellar required great expertise and practice, while the other side would say, well, anybody could do that with a bit of medical training. There were also conflicting arguments about the piece of flesh. Did it actually have the scar that Belle Elmore was known to have from an operation?
It was like a Y-shaped scar, some of which could be a crease, other parts of which was surgical.
It was folded over, and there was argument whether the scar was in fact a fold of flesh or whether it was a scar. Spilsbury convinced the jury that it was a scar.
That scar was consistent with an operation. Her sister travelled over from America and gave evidence at the Old Bailey to this effect.
The interesting thing is, in recent years, a sort of DNA has been done on the remains. Kora's DNA doesn't match up any of the surviving family.
DNA evidence suggested that the flesh was male.
All of which adds to the controversy.
At the time of the Crippen trial, though, the evidence presented to the court was groundbreaking, and people were going to be naturally hesitant about accepting it. But in Bernard Spilsbury, the prosecution had an expert who was going to change the face of forensic science.
Bernard Spilsbury gave evidence about the higher sin, and actually it was the first famous case in which Bernard Spilsbury had given this expert evidence as a pathologist. He became very eminent in the next 30 years and became very famous indeed.
Crippen had a formidable court opponent in Bernard Spilsbury, but he did have Edward Marshall Hall, known as the Great Defender, on his team. Hall had successfully defended Robert Wood 3 years earlier in the case of the Camden town murder. After some discussion, however, as the trial approached, Hall decided not to lead Crippin's defense. Crippen was in real trouble. The prosecution was led by Richard Muir, who secured conviction in the Stratton brothers case, the first men to be convicted of murder on fingerprint evidence. When Muir was appointed prosecutor, Crippen is reported to have said, "I wish it had been anyone else. I fear the worst." Crippen was damned by the actions he took both before and after Belle's disappearance.
On the early morning of the 1st of February, you were left alone in your house with your wife. Is that correct?
Yes.
She was alive?
Yes.
And well?
She was.
Do you know of anybody in the world who has seen your wife alive since?
I do not.
Do you know of anybody who has received a letter from her since?
I do not.
Do you know of anyone who could swear they ever saw your wife leave that house alive?
I told Mr. Dew all the facts.
But you have made no inquiries.
I have made no inquiries.
It would be most important for your defense if someone could be found who saw your wife after the Martinettis did. You do realize that?
I do.
And you have made no inquiries.
I have made no inquiries.
In my whole dealings with him, I'd saw nothing which, by the wildest stretch of the imagination, could suggest a capacity for so terrible a crime. But I never entertained a doubt about his guilt.
The jury took just 27 minutes to reach their verdict. Guilty. Ethel Leneve was tried separately as an accessory after the fact, but in truth, the prosecutor's heart was not in it. The case was a slender one, and she was acquitted.
I think Ethel may have known what had happened. I don't think she could have been that completely innocent. That she foolishly walked around wearing Mrs. Crippin's jewellery and Mrs. Crippin's furs. She must have had knowledge of the murder. I can't believe that she took these things and didn't ask how or why they'd been left behind.
It was an accident, killing Kora. It must have been. I would still marry him.
They have their rules. I won't be getting you in trouble again.
You look well.
Yeah, they're taking care of me. Darling, you have been my one comfort all these years. My one comfort. God bless you, my darling.
Crippen appealed against his death sentence to the then Home Secretary, Winston Churchill. Churchill went over the case in detail, but decided against commuting the sentence to life imprisonment. He did, however, allow this final personal meeting between Crippen and Ethel at Pentonville Prison before the execution. Crippen was hanged on the 23rd of November, 1910. He may be long dead, but fascination for the man lives on. His story has been retold many times in varying literary and film adaptations. The case was a sensation in its day, but unanswered questions remain. What really happened in that house that night? How much did Ethel really know? Occasional attempts are made to prove Crippin's innocence, but there can be little doubt of the guilt of the killer of Camden Town.